Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Caffarella. He's visiting us here from the University of Washington. He's interviewing. And his work at the University of Washington has largely included a lot of work on information extraction and sort of viewing the web as a source of information, almost in a database sense. He's done a lot of really cool stuff, including he sort of was the co-founder for Nutch, which is an open source search engine, and Hadoop, which is an open source sort of MapReduce project. And so with that, Michael.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. My name is Mike, and I'm going to be talking about my research at UW today. The title of it is going to be Extracting and Managing Structured Web Data. This is joint work with my advisors, my team of advisors, Oren Etzioni, Dan Suchu, and then Alon Halevi, who is a once and maybe future UW professor. We can hope. Also a number of my fellow students. Anyway, so let's get started. If you've done a lot of work in the web area, you'll instantly recognize this as an extremely realistic rendering of a web page. It might be a little more clear if we do something like this. You draw a kind of semi-fictional graph around it. Now, for the last 10 years or maybe even more, the standard academic way of modeling the web has been as a hyperlink graph of these unstructured bags of text. And the only kind of structure comes from the links that the pages might make to each other, and to some limited extent, the URL hierarchy. However, in real life, this is emphatically not the case. Here's a fairly unremarkable web page. And what you can see at the bottom of this web page is something that looks an awful lot like a traditional relational database. A small one, but a structured database nonetheless. In the first column here, you've got presidential names. It has even got a label. Here you've got party, which is with the label party. Here you've got a typed column of numbers, dates for the president's term, and so on. I should mention that feel free to ask questions in the middle or whenever you like. And so here's a web page that isn't structured. It's just raw HTML. No one's using any kind of structured format to describe their data, but it's structured data nonetheless. Here's another page that seems about as textual as it gets. But if we look at one small sentence here, Albert Einstein was born in Germany on such and such date. This is undeniably natural language text, but it's also text that we can process by machine pretty straightforwardly, and that we can extract a very well-defined typed piece of data from. You can imagine that if we were to process many of these web pages, all of which describe the was born in relationship from many different people in many different places, we could compile a very small database out of it. So, in the modern web that you and I use every day, these real life web pages actually contain an awful lot of structure that is obvious to you and me, but our machines, our database tools right now, tend to ignore it. Search engines, at least at the query, at least in the side that is exposed to us, totally ignore it. The only kind of query you can do against a search engine is to mumble out a few words, and you get back a ranked list of URLs in response. There's no kind of query you can do on who was born on certain dates or where certain scientists were born. In a traditional database, you do have a much more expressive query language, but they certainly can't handle web pages. The import interfaces not only assume the data is relatively clean and well structured, and certainly not with all this strange advertising and other text around it, but also they make certain bad assumptions about scale. And to some extent, that's from a systems perspective, but it's also from a user and administrative perspective. So, for example, it's common to assume that every table in your database will at least be somewhat human. A human being will know the name of each of your tables. That might be reasonable when you have a few dozen tables. I know some complicated schemas have up to thousands, in which case you have to do a little bit of trickery. But on the web, we have hundreds of millions of tables. It's unreasonable to assume that anyone can even know the existence of more than just a tiny number of these. So my research vision that I'm going to describe a few early steps toward today is something I call the structured web, which is, what if we had an automatically cleanly structured version of all the structured data that's already out there, but in kind of a primitive form right now? Another way of saying this is that we have the database of everything that's compiled from the web text that we're all familiar with. So one of the things that you could build on top of this would be a highly expressive version of web search. So for example, you could ask, please tell me some inventors or scientists and the year of their birth and what they might have invented. So you could express it in a kind of data log style query, like the kind I've put up there. And I had a paper a couple years ago that describes how you might implement a system like this. And you might get back something like this, where you have one column for the inventor or the scientist, another column for their inventions, and a third column describing the year of their birth. And so what you would like is something that has the breadth of a search engine, but the expressiveness of a traditional database. Other kinds of applications you could build on top of this sort of structured database of everything is a very easy way to do data analysis and reuse. So for example, someone in a knowledge worker using some kind of Excel-style application could simply say, show me data on population statistics in a number of cities. And rather than having to compile that data by hand or clean it in advance, the system could find that data automatically and could instantly drop you into some kind of analysis and visualization tool. Another would be to do data integration over a lot of these things. So one query you might want to do is to compile all the program committee members from a certain conference, SIGMOD in this case, over all the years that this conference has ever been in business. Now that data exists on the web. It's just scattered over a dozen different websites in a lot of different formats. So one year it was in HTML tables, another in lists, another year in text, maybe one year it was in a JPEG, who knows. But no one's ever intended that data to be reused. So it should be, since that data is out there, it should be very easy to express kind of structural queries over that data. And this is a bit more of a vision, or more than a vision. We actually have that implemented to a substantial degree, and that will be the last project I talk about today. So here's a kind of graphical description of a lot of the projects I've worked on recently. Know-it-all was an information extraction project, and it gave birth to a few others, like a bindings engine, which was more index support, and TextRunner. And then I also worked on some open source projects, Nutch and Hadoop. I'm not going to talk about most of these today. The few I am going to talk about are these three: TextRunner, which operates over natural language text to generate the structured information; WebTables, which obtains structured information from raw HTML tables it finds on the web; and the Octopus project, which allows the user to tie together some of this extracted data. And so those three different subject matters, text, tables, and then both lists and tying it together, are going to form the structure of the talk today. I should make one note that people often think of the deep web, meaning databases that have an HTML front end that you can only access with an active post or a query against them. And that intersects with the structured web, but it's not the same thing. A lot of the HTML tables that we find are clearly not dynamically generated from a database. And to the extent that you can detect dynamic generation by using a parameterized URL, for example, then a very substantial number of the tables that we look at have nothing to do with the deep web. And obviously, natural language text has nothing to do with it. And in the future, there may be all sorts of kinds of sources of structured data that'll be very different from this. So if I had to describe the sort of style of work I'm going to do, the motivating problem would be that information extraction has been around for a long time, but though a lot of its very basic assumptions don't scale to the web as a whole. One is that we have to be domain independent if we're actually going to process all the web's information, that we can't assume that there's any kind of topic-specific extraction rule or training data or anything else. A lot of projects in the past have focused on extracting, say, corporate intelligence information, and that's far too limiting for the kind of vision that we have for this data. Another is that we have a very reasonable model of human use. So we don't require that every data source you have already have a wrapper written by a human administrator. We need 3 million human administrators just to track the data we already have. And further, that we don't assume users have crazy information about the web that's just unreasonable. Then finally, a more straightforward problem is that we need scalable computer systems for a lot of these things, that information extraction historically has never considered how to solve problems from a systems aspect. And to solve these, we'll be drawing on a number of techniques from both databases, AI, and systems literature as well. So let's jump into the first project, which processes natural language text. So the goal here is to take a sentence like this one, Einstein was born in Germany, and transform it into a structured tuple that has two entities, Einstein and Germany, which are drawn from a technical definition of an entity is a little bit hard, but it's an identifiable object somewhere in the world. And they are tied together by the binary was born in relationship in this case. So the goal is to take a corpus of text and emit a number of these accurate fact extraction tuples. Now, in this case, a lot of these textual extraction systems have the problems that I just mentioned. They either require handwritten extraction rules or hand-tagged training data, and that's a problem not only from a scalability perspective, but also they tend to be tagged on a very clean or particular corpus, like the corpus of Wall Street Journal text, right, which has not a lot to do with the corpus of web text. They have a lot of different characteristics. They also require you often to specify the interesting relationships ahead of time. If you want to complete your task in any kind of reasonable amount of time, this is not something that you can ask the system to do. It's difficult to say how many relations there are, interesting relations there are in the universe, but we guess it numbers at least in the thousands. And if you look at just the number of unique relationship style strings, it's in the hundreds of thousands. So we can't ask a system to enumerate these ahead of time. We want to process the entire corpus in one fell swoop. And then finally, a lot of these systems require a very expensive deep parse of the data using natural language parsing techniques, and that's going to be very expensive at a very large scale. So our system TextRunner is something we call open information extraction, which is first of all, solves a lot of these problems. First of all, it's domain independent, so we have no topic-specific extraction rules, no training data, and no administrators who mark things up. The target relations are discovered as we go, and then also we do a number of tricks to make it computationally efficient at scale. So the system's built in 3 steps. In the first stage, we build what we call an extraction classifier or a candidate classifier. And the goal of this classifier is going to be a black box that can process a large amount of text. And whenever it comes up with a candidate extraction, something that looks roughly like a fact triple, it'll say yes rather than no. The way we're going to do this is by first running a very expensive parser on a relatively small subset of the text to try to generate some very reliable examples of extraction. Once we have those examples, we then generate a series of very inexpensive features on top of it. So things like simple part-of-speech tagging of the words, or punctuation use, or a handful of other techniques. And then that gives us a training set that we can use where we map those inexpensive features to a set of what we believe are very accurate true-false declarations, or whether it's a good extraction or not. In the second stage, we take that trained classifier and we run it over the entire corpus. And this is a very inexpensive technique. And the goal here is that by doing this trick, we've reduced the amount of time from being order dr, that is the number of documents and the number of relations, to simply being a function of the number of documents in our corpus. Then finally, we don't believe that this extractor is actually going to work all the time. In fact, a lot of the time it's not going to work at all. So we use frequency-based assessment to try to figure out what a good extraction is. And the observation here is that true facts will be relatively popular and agreed upon by people, whereas untrue ones will be idiosyncratic. That you might have an untrue fact or one that's incorrectly parsed will only appear once or twice on the web. But the fact that New York is a city, or Albert Einstein was born in Germany, we expect to see those many, many times over the entire web. Now, this runs into problems when you have true but unpopular facts, or alternatively when you have conspiracy theories. Now, the set of conspiracy theories is relievedly fairly low. The set of true but unpopular facts is much higher, and one of my fellow students has done a lot of research into how you can get the recall up. I'm not going to talk about that today, but for the set of facts that do appear, a large set of common facts, this technique works fairly well. So here's a brief sample of web pages and what we find in them. So we've, on a large sample of several million web pages, we found about 11.3 raw tuples. Those are unique tuples which have already been deduplicated. Of those, we believe about 7.8 million are what we call well-formed, so that the entities make some semantic sense and the relationships make sense as well. These are strings that you and I would guess at is a good title for a small database. Of these 7.8 million, about 1 million are concrete assertions about the universe, so where Einstein was born. The remainder are abstract facts, things like scientists discover theories. Now, these may not seem actually very useful, but they're great from a schema discovery or ontology discovery perspective. If you want to do reasoning about the way the world is structured, those facts are very helpful. And then we get accuracy results that are not perfect, but certainly in line with other domain-independent techniques. So about 80% for the abstract ones and 88% for the concrete ones. Yeah?
Out of this, Wikipedia has 2.5 million pages. Out of this, how many words in Wikipedia And those that weren't in Wikipedia, what was the accuracy? Or free-base. I mean, just take one of these big, right, encyclopedic collections, and that's the improvement. If you can get 80% on stuff that wasn't there.
Right. So I can't tell you its overlap with Wikipedia right now. The thing to observe, though, is that we're operating over generic web text. So if you believe that there are facts in the universe that aren't in Wikipedia, then hopefully we do quite well on it. Or we have a stab at collecting these facts. In addition, the abstract ones, things like scientists discover theories, these aren't going to be in a structured form in Freebase or Wikipedia at all, right? Those databases are going to be raw collections of concrete assertions about the world.
Well, there are. I mean, list of just important discoveries and stuff like that. There are pages like this in Wikipedia. But again, I mean, you might not have enough redundancy for stuff that's not in Wikipedia already. So
you're right. There's an interesting investigation to do, which is how large is the space of objects that are frequent enough on the web to detect, but infrequent enough that they don't show up in Wikipedia. And that will be a great first project for me to do after I'm done with my work here at UW. Yeah?
Just a simple question. What was your corpus?
This was a generic web crawl. So we started it with sort of the DMOZ links and did a breadth-first search.
Okay.
Yeah?
What's the notion of correct? How did you find out what was correct?
Oh, correct. We asked some hapless grad students to assess a few thousand examples of whether they're just simply factually true. And if 2 of them agree that it's true, then we count it as true. Yeah?
Did you ask them in context, or did you just have triples?
The question is whether it accurately reflects the fact asserted in the sentence. So you do have the sentence. Yeah. Okay. So here are a few more experimental results. When we compare this to a competing system, one of my previous projects where you have to indicate the relationship ahead of time, our error rate is actually a third lower on a set of 10 chosen relationships. And the reason here is that we are including a lot more sort of this contextual information, these lightweight features that our system generates. But the point is that we're very competitive with these projects that couldn't scale to the entire web. When it comes to performance, we take about 85 CPU hours for this entire corpus, which was on the order of roughly 10 million pages in this case. When on our competing system, the know-it-all project, we were taking 6.3 hours per relation. So in this sample, we found 278,000 unique relationship strings. Now, a lot of these are synonyms, and a lot of them don't make sense. However, if you want to extract everything on the web, the naive approach would be to ask a more traditional system to please extract each of these 278,000 relationship strings. And when you consider it from that angle, the improvement that our technique gets is many orders of magnitude, that it's infeasible, even if you count the set of plausible relations, which we believe is on the order of 10 to 20,000, it's still far more efficient to use our technique rather than one in which you have to enumerate the relationships ahead of time. And as a further note, as a note of the computational scalability, we have run this on a much larger corpus of over 500 million pages. And in that case, we get over 200 million unique tuples. So this can actually be applied to a very large set and successfully. So to sum up the contributions here, our OpenIE architecture for things can get good results in a domain-independent way. And also we reduce the runtime substantially. So from a systems perspective, from an algorithmic perspective, and from a sort of domain scaling perspective, we've beaten the traditional extraction systems. Yeah?
So you said you use this sort of simple classifiers instead of the full parses.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you know to what extent that made your accuracy worse? If you had used the full parse, do you know if it would have been more accurate?
It would have been. These experiments exist, but I can't tell you the numbers off the top of my head. One of my fellow students went on to do more work in the extraction area and examine the difference of these, but I can't tell them to you right now. Yeah?
Sort of keying on John's question earlier, if you had been more selective about the documents that you process, would you have been in almost as good, in terms of numbers of relationships and precision?
I think the thing that I noticed that confuses the system a lot are these. If you find a piece of pathological text that makes its way past the initial classifier and also for mechanical reasons might be reproduced many times. So for example, if you have a piece of boilerplate legal text which makes some assertion that we have a misparse, then the fact that it's on the bottom of a zillion different web pages is really going to provide a lot of confidence that it's totally correct. So there may be something to be said about throwing out one page versus another because you believe site A is more credible than site B. What I think would be more productive is looking at different sub-regions of a given page to say that there seems to be one part of the page that was written by a human being, another part that was reproduced by a machine, and another part that is navigational text, and focusing only on the stuff that matches our sort of intellectual model of how the text is being emitted. Because certainly that assumption that true facts are repeated and untrue ones are not repeated, that doesn't apply when you're talking about mechanical reproduction. Yeah?
You don't have any structure on top of this. There are these relationships that are accurate, let's say highly accurate, right?
Mm-hmm.
You still want to evaluate usefulness in some sense. So have you looked at trying to solve track QA or some tasks where you can evaluate, are these useful relationships that we're extracting? You take the GSS data and you have from every creek in the US, latitude, longitude. So you have, I don't know, tens of millions of facts.
Yeah.
But if I try to apply that to any of these tasks, it's not going to help me much. It's
Yeah.
going to maybe answer one question in track K. So have you tried to, I don't know, evaluate what's the usefulness of this unstructured?
Well, we've done assessments on. Well, the question here is substantially how do you pick the workload that you're going to run against it, right? What is the? You can take one approach from simply assessing the accuracy of the raw facts that you've discovered, which I described here. Another point would be on a established workload of facts, something that everyone agrees are interesting. To what extent can you reproduce them? And on the experimental result that I mentioned first, those 10 randomly chosen facts are chosen from kind of the most frequent extractive relationships, with some filter for throwing out the garbage ones. And these are very plausible ones like was born in, found, invented, things that would make sense to you and me. To that limited extent, we can say that we're we do a great job at reproducing these. Now, how useful is the long tail of true facts? We haven't judged that against some kind of other. We haven't assessed how useful the long tail of true but not as common as those first handful of facts are. That's partially because it's very difficult to say that there's no accepted library of things that are undeniably true and useful in a genre like this. We're trying to get that. We're trying to approach that a little bit in that query system I mentioned earlier. And how good is it for a kind of structured search perspective? And we only have anecdotal evidence of that so far, nothing that's statistically reliable. Yeah?
Have you given any thought to collapsing synonym relations? Because it seems like one of the problems we might have is like if I wanted to find me all the people born in 1982,
yeah.
I'd get some, but if it was expressed slightly differently, even though it was the same relation, I might not get the other ones.
In the experiments I showed you here, we are doing some kind of some linguistic normalization. So very small differences in expression will collapse into a single relationship. In later work that I don't talk about here, we did work that you automatically collapses synonyms that have been computed using statistics that are based on the DIRT method from Lin and Pantel. So that basically looks at do you have a lot of entities that seem to overlap to an unusual extent with the same string. So created and invented, they're not technically exactly the same, but they're often used colloquially in the same manner. And so we find those as synonyms, for example, even though by any kind of string edit distance metric, you would never find them. Yeah?
You do it for name referencing, dereferencing?
You can do that. There's work by Alex Yates, who's a graduated member of my group, who did this who built a system in this way that is sort of a left and a right-handed algorithm. It works for some time to build up a synonym set, then performs the inverse operation where you try to look for relationships that have uniquely high sharing of certain strings. And to some extent, you can find aliases. So A. Einstein and Albert Einstein will come out of something like that.
One last question.
Yeah.
What do you do with contradictory information?
We don't try to do reasoning over this right now. So in unpublished work, we've done a little bit of that. So for example, you can extract George Bush as the president and Barack Obama as the president, right? These facts can't be true simultaneously, but that's only because we know that certain things about the presidency. It is theoretically, it's very difficult but possible to extract certain things like functional relationships in your data to know that only one person can be the president at a time. And I don't have any published work in that area yet, though I've played around with it somewhat. Okay. And I should say that a lot of those problems are pretty similar to data modeling things. So constraints that a schema designer might put in their database map pretty effectively to a lot of these kind of factual conflicting problems. But in the limit, it's kind of AI complete. So area for future work. All right, so let's jump into another form of structured data on the web, which comes as tables. So here's our database from earlier on the bottom half of this page. And as I mentioned, here's our schema that we can extract from the page. So there's a lot of structured data here. There's not only the contents, there's also the schema information. Now here's on the right-hand column here, you can't make out the details, but what you can make out is that this page is actually pretty big. What I showed you earlier was just a very tiny snippet of it. So here's the piece of the database I showed you. Here's another HTML table on the same page, which has a single row and 26 columns, A to Z. Now, that's an HTML table, but it'd be a pretty dumb relational database to create. No one's starting up SQL Server and plugging that into it. In fact, if you look at the pages overall, there are 16 HTML tables on this page, and the vast majority of them are used for layout or for some kind of eccentric purpose that's not transmitting relational data. So our first challenge in this project is going to be to find the items that actually do transmit reasonable structured data. The second one is because these databases that we extract, oftentimes, or at some form, they do have a schema because we believe that the columns are typed. But they also often have a very precise or a label schema because most of the time people put labels at the top of these columns. When we process this at very large scale, we can get a huge number of schemas. People have talked about work doing on schema collections in the past, but we believe we have this at a scale that no one's ever had before. And so a second challenge of this project is what can you do when you have all the schema information? And that's going to be mainly what I talk about today, but I'll talk a little bit about the architecture of how we find these tables in the first place. So this is the WebTables project, and the rough pipeline is that we start with a very large raw crawl of the web. Again, it's not focused or tailored to any one domain. Use a simple DOM parser to find the raw HTML tables from this. Use a series of classifiers to recover the relations, that is, filter out what we believe are being used for page layout or some other purpose. And then finally, and then also recover the schema where possible. And then finally construct a database of schema statistics, so basically counts over all the schema usages, and build some applications on top of that. So when I talk about a database or a relation, our notion of a relational database always just has a single table in it, and we have columns that have types, which we estimate because oftentimes text doesn't have a declared type. You have to figure it out from what's actually there, and then labels that we can reconstruct from the page. Now, we had a very large crawl in this case, which had 14 billion raw HTML tables in it, and we estimate that it contains about 154 million good relational databases. That came from taking a very large sample of these and again asking some unfortunate grad students to mark up what seemed like high-quality structured databases. So our filtering system, or our extraction system, has two stages. One is simply to say yes or no to a relation, whether it's a relational database. Another is to say yes or no as to whether the first row of that database is transmitting labels for the columns. We use both handwritten and statistically trained classifiers for this. And the features that we use tend to have some rough correspondence with database modeling techniques. So for example, oftentimes when you're designing a database, you'll say whether it's acceptable to have a null in a certain cell. That's a constraint you can place on it. In our case, the number of nulls in your database in the table is correlates very highly with the quality of the table. That if you have a database that's basically empty, then it's probably not a very good relational database. And most of when compared to our test set, we'll say it's not a relational database at all. We also do other things like as part of your schema declaration in a traditional database, you'll have to say what the type is for any one column. Well, we try to look at the contents of a single column, see whether there are number versus string conflicts or numerical and date conflicts, things like that. For columns that are entirely strings, we try to guess as to types by seeing whether there's huge variance in the string length. So the idea is that strings that are drawn from a single type will tend to be very roughly the same length. If you have strings where one entry is 5 characters and the next entry is 2,000 characters, this is probably not a coherent type that we're talking about. So I'm not going to go into the details of the classifiers in any length, only to say that we get, again, like all domain-independent extractors, we get good but not fantastic performance out of these. That recall tends to be in the 80s. We tuned the relational filterer for high recall at the expense of precision. That's okay for the applications we'll talk about. For metadata detection, we can get precision close to 90% on these things for saying yes or no as to whether someone has put labels in place. Now, that means we extract about 271 million databases, of which 125 million we believe are good. And it means, as I mentioned, over about 2.5 million unique relational schemas. A schema in this case is just a bag of attribute labels.
Do you do that at all?
The schema use?
Relational schemas, yeah. In other words,
Yeah, that's 2.5 million unique schemas.
Okay, so you actually do try to combine things that overlap.
If they match...
There's lots of different ways of expressing it with headers. Okay.
Right, so if the set of attributes is identical to another set of attributes, then those count as a single schema from this counts perspective. If they overlap, if you have one schema that says make model, another that says make model year, we count those as 2 distinct schemas. Now, we do make use of the fact they overlap in the next slide. So we're going to gather a bunch of very simple counts over these statistics. So whenever we see an individual database, here we have make model year and a single entry in the database, we'll simply bump a count for an entry that's labeled with all the attributes in the schema. If we find another database that no matter how many tuples it has in it, we'll count that as simply another occurrence. And we duplicate for website here. So some kind of crazy fan of used cars can't plug 10,000 examples of his own favorite schema and skew the results here. We kind of do a very simple form of anti-schema spamming here. If we have one that overlaps slightly, as I mentioned, make, model, year, and color, we count that as a separate count in our statistics database, and so on for a number of other different schemas. Now, the point, this doesn't seem very sophisticated, but the point here is that once we have all these statistics, we can compute a bunch of probabilities over attribute use. So given a randomly chosen database from what we consider the universe of possible databases, I can tell you the probability that you'll see make versus the probability that you'll find zip code in it. Further, and more interestingly, you can compute conditional probabilities. So what's the probability that you'll see make given that model is already in the table? And also, what's the probability of seeing make given that zip code is already in the table? Hopefully, the probability of that left-hand quantity is much higher than the right-hand quantity. Do you have a question in the back?
So brand, model, year would count as a different schema. There's no deduplication at attribute level that you do.
Right. If the two bags or the two sets of attributes only overlap but are not contained in each other, they're not exactly equivalent, then those count as 2 distinct schemas.
Is it possible that the same keyword is used in different contexts?
Yes, so name is the most popular attribute out there, and that's used in file listings, in MP3 listings, in Rolodex-style address books. Name is used all over the place. So I'm going to talk about 2 applications that we build on top of this data. The first is going to be what I call a Schema Autocomplete tool. So the idea here is that we have some kind of novice database user who shows up and wants to make a small database. And we are going to have tab complete on the schema design for that person. So they enter make. hit tab, and all of a sudden we're going to try to output make, model, year, and price to say, here are the probably pretty useful attributes that you have. Now the algorithm here is going to be very basic. We're simply going to have an input set of assumed attributes, basically what the user has entered and what our algorithm has already emitted, and we're going to repeatedly emit the most probable next attribute conditioned on what's already there. And the important thing to note is that this would be not possible if it weren't for these probabilities that we've already computed because we did extraction at such large scale. Here's some sample outputs that we can get from it. So we ask the system, please compute the schema for name, and what we emit in this case is name, size, last modified, and type. Now, your point earlier that name might be used in multiple different ways, that's true. So this is not the only schema that you could get from name. It's simply what our precise algorithm here has emitted, which is not even necessarily the most probable, but is a very rough approximation of the most probable. If you were to run the algorithm several times and sort of disqualify previous attributes, then you can, again, have an approximation of different schemas in the area. So if you enter instructor, then we'll emit something that roughly corresponds to a course announcement style schema. And similarly for these others. So if there are not US-born people in the audience, this AB stands for at-bats and is basically a schema of baseball statistics information. So this appears all over the place in various newspapers and such. So we've reproduced a box score here. And there are a lot of other examples in the paper here. Now, when we asked human users to try to do the same task, that is, I give an experienced schema designer the word name and ask them to come up with the same schema, we want to see the extent to which our system can mechanically reproduce what a human would do. So for each of these, we asked 2 human beings to write their own schema and considered the intersection of their outputs as the true set. So where 2 human beings agree on what the relevant schema is, that's what we think is the target set of our algorithm. In this case, we ran the system 3 times, the first schema we emit, the second and the third, and see the extent to which we can reproduce what the humans did. So we consider schema design kind of a high-level trained cognitive task. And yet in this case, when we consider the top 3 schemas, we can see that we reproduce over this reasonable workload of domains over 60% of what a human being would do. So the second application of this data I want to talk about is synonym discovery. So the task here is, again, given a domain, we want to compute all the relevant synonyms in the area. And this is something that is often assumed in the data integration literature. So when you want to merge 2 databases, it's very handy to know that emp equals emp ID and that they should map to each other. Now that's assumed as an input in a lot of systems, but actually compiling that resource is a lot harder than you might think. Not only are there a lot of interesting ones that Roget's isn't going to contain, right? Most people aren't saying employee and subsidiary worker or whatever a linguistic synonym of employee would be. They're often using either technical language or these kind of typographic synonyms like here telephone equals tel pound. In practice, these dictionaries are only built up through a lot of sweat that people find what doesn't work and add a new entry to the database. If we can compile this automatically, it would be a big help to people. So the solution is going to rely on a handful of observations. First is that 2 synonymous attributes generally won't appear in the same schema together. That it wouldn't make any sense for them to co-occur. The second is that we don't want to just have trivial synonyms, for things like misspellings. There may be applications in which that's useful, but for the moment, we're going to assume that we only want attributes that actually occur some bare minimum of a number of times. And then finally, that they should keep the same company, that attributes that are synonymous should have co-schemas that are very similar. We can summarize these observations in the following scoring function for 2 candidate synonyms A and B. So we come up with a synonym score for 2 candidates A and B. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about how this works, except to point out, again, that we rely very heavily on these marginal and conditional probabilities that we compute from the extracted corpus of schema information. And here are the results that we can get out of it. So when I ask someone to come up with name, we get the top ranked synonyms from the system. So e-mail equals email, phone equals telephone, date equals last modified, and so on. Oops. For instructor, we get a lot of things that are, again, relevant to the course announcement area, so that course title equals title, course equals course pound, and so on. And here's the other domains that I mentioned earlier. And again, if you are a baseball fan, you note my finest achievement as a researcher, which is to note that strikeouts equals K, according to this system. So K is kind of an obscure shorthand for saying strikeouts in the baseball universe, and technology can now find that out. So everyone will be relieved about that. And again, there are more examples of this in the paper. And for the again, for the real estate domain, you have similar things, that price equals rent when you're talking about real estate. So when we evaluate these, it's tough to say how, in a pure sense, what the recall is, how many synonyms there are in the world. So instead, we're going to test whether the system has imposed a high-quality ordering on the set of synonyms, whether the top ones that we emit are better than the later ones that we emit. Yeah?
Can you estimate what fraction of those are not catchable with just simple syntactic rules, such as pluralization, punctuation, and pounds, and name and title?
I think that is... I think that... I don't have any numbers on that. I think the set of universally applicable and useful syntactic operations is pretty small. And there's some evidence in this as to even in a general case, even very simple syntactic operations like, say, sentence tokenization are kind of famously difficult when you're processing these either from an NLP or search style perspective, right? So that would be an interesting experiment to do. I'm not super optimistic that those rules exist.
Is this all English only?
I'm sorry?
Is this all only in English?
The experiments are only in English, but we constrained ourselves to English language web pages, but there's nothing about it that would prevent you from applying to...
You don't find equivalents in other languages?
No, not in this experiment. It's an interesting thing to talk about whether some of the techniques that I've talked about, I think they would apply pretty universally in Western-style languages. I don't think they would apply in Korean for certain reasons, or at least the TextRunner things. You run into difficulties in other languages that have different styles of use. But at least in Western languages, these seem to be pretty widely applicable. Okay, so let's take a look at, again, the sort of ranking of things. And we can see that as we go from the top 5, the second 5, the third 5, and so on, we do have a very reasonable drop-off in the average number of true synonyms that we're finding. So this is a rough summary of how well our ranking of potential synonyms in the world is actually working. So the contributions here are that we've actually achieved a pretty novel data set for the first time, that there have been attempts to recover tables from databases from tables in the past, but they have operated only at a very low scale. And we estimate that we're at least 5 orders of magnitude larger than some of these previous collections. And that further, being so large enables us to compute these stats that lets us do these novel applications on top of it. Okay. So I'm going to talk about one last task, which is on how you deal with multiple tables and to some extent how you deal with HTML lists on the web. So data integration, sometimes known as mashup tools when applied to a web setting, they're often, at least the existing web tools, are often designed from a very traditional database perspective. So, for example, they assume that the user knows about all the potential data sources, which again is very reasonable in a traditional database setting. And they also ask an administrator to write wrappers about existing data sources. So if your data source doesn't come in XML eventually, there's not much you can do with most mashup tools out there. But these are totally unreasonable for the vast majority of data out there. That users are never going to know about all the data sources, and also the vast majority of data doesn't have wrappers around it, and we don't want to ask a administrator to come write a wrapper for the top 5,000 web domains. When we go through our proposed system, we'll find that the line between integration and extraction is a little bit blurred. So let's first walk through, I'm going to describe a walk through the application, and here the challenge is to find a set of all the SIGMOD program committee members. So again, this data is scattered over a dozen different websites from SIGMOD over the last few years. And the data has never been presented in a coherent way intended for reuse. As I mentioned, it should be easy to obtain this data, but it's very difficult for humans nowadays. we're going to implement this. Octopus is going to solve this problem by offering a handful of operators. And these are more similar to model management operators in that they are best effort ones that try to emit high quality results. They're not like traditional SQL database operators that have a correct or incorrect answer to them. So the four here, search simply finds a set of relevant relations for you. Split will try to transform an HTML list into a full table. So a list is, you can think of as often appears as a relational database where the columnar breaks have been lost. That people will simply blurt out Mike Caffarella, University of Washington, 2005, as the relevant tuple for a row in the database, often without even any kind of typographic clues as to where the breaks come. The human readers assume to make the breaks naturally, but that's obviously impossible for a machine. The context operation is going to recover useful data from the surrounding text. So for example, most examples of structured data might appear on a website that's tied to a certain year. That year is not going to appear on every row in the tuple. In a lot of cases, colloquially, you find that data that applies to every row in the database is put in the title of the page or in the surrounding text, not into the table itself. We want to recover some of that information because we're going to do manipulation of the data after the fact. Join, this will let you do a little bit further query. I'm not going to talk about it today, but just to acknowledge that it exists, you want to find the students of Sigmod PC members. So essentially does another kind of search query for every entry in a database you've already constructed. So let's take a look at the interface for the demo tool that I've constructed so far. So here you have a very generic search box style interface. And the user enters Sigmod program committee. This is the equivalent to invoking the search operator. What we get back is a very large scattering of tables, but every item here, circled in red, is an individual database that we've extracted from somewhere on the web. Every row represents a cluster of these databases, so we believe that these databases are both topically similar and also have some amount of structural compatibility. So it would be rare, or we hope it would be rare, to find one table with a single column and another table with 10 columns. Everything in a cluster is meant to be unionable. Let's examine one particular cluster. So in this case, one of the tables is a single column or a double column table where the first column is the reviewer's name and the second column is the institution where that person can be found. In this case, Serge Abiteboul is the first entry and he's from n-ary, like the table says here. Now, you can think that these operators are essentially attempting to reconstruct a more traditional kind of a local as view data integration representation. We never ask the user to think of it that way, but the operators present our best guess as to what that description should be. And then through mechanical means, the user can interact with the system and kind of edit that description. So in this case, the system has made a guess as to what the relevant contents of this cluster or this union assertion ought to be. And we find that it made a mistake in a couple places. So the user can simply X them out, and the system will automatically try to repopulate it with different better tables. In this case, this table looks exactly like the one I showed you earlier, but it was reconstructed from an HTML list, not an HTML table. And so we simply had a raw string that had the entire contents of a row in it. And you can see we occasionally make mistakes, like here we've broken someone's first name and last name incorrectly. You can make, again, hand modifications. As earlier, you can split things by hand if you find a difficulty. And so on. All right, so here, we might want to, be able to recover context from the surrounding page. So here we have a typical two-column table that we found on a number of different web pages. We invoke the context operator, and the system is going to suggest a number of values that it thinks apply to every row in the table. So in this case, we're going to find that Beijing in 2007 apply to every row in this table. And sure enough, this table was derived from the 2007 Sigmod that took place in China. So we can adorn the table with this extra information, and then when we union them, hopefully we have that across a number of different websites, and we can actually retain the information that the website assumed was obvious to every human viewer, but becomes non-obvious when you try to aggregate multiple websites. And finally, we can compute a union of these things. And the things to note once we actually union all these tables together is that we've recovered a database of 243 tuples in this example, 223 of which are totally correct. Both structurally, we've broken them at the right places. Factually, these people actually were Sigmod PC members, and their institution is accurate. And also from a formatting perspective, we don't have one cell blank and one empty, or one full, for example. In the cluster here, we've drawn this from 5 different sources across 3 different years. So often a single website will break things into one track versus another track, and we've recovered that information here. But no one ever reformatted this. No one ever formatted this data for reuse. Some of this is 4 or 5 years old, and no one had any idea that I would come along to try to mash it up with other people. No one ever had to write an explicit extractor or wrapper with this, and the user has only made about 2 or 3 mouse clicks. One's text query and 2 or 3 clicks to clean things up. So the path from notion of database to the actual final product is very, very short. And I've just mentioned these contributions. So we're basically out of time, but I'm going to mention a little bit about future work in this area. On the WebTables project, I think that the autocomplete and the synonym computation are just the beginning of what you could do a lot of interesting semantic services on top of this data. So for example, you could have 2 operations which are sort of the inverse of each other. Database auto-populate, where a user provides a schema, and then you find that the database automatically appears. This, I think, would be great in a kind of information worker style application like Excel, where you want to do some operations over interesting data, you type a few columns, and all of a sudden you're working with a database, and the sort of road to getting it to working is very, very short. And the reverse operation, schema auto-generate, is going to be useful in some settings where you have a bunch of data and you actually want to estimate what the right schema is. We've done, I have a piece of published work in that area and how you might get that to work. For Octopus, the data integration one, what I showed you were screenshots from a demo application in which the user has to invoke very few operations. There are various systems reasons why the length of time between a mouse click and results is longer than you might like. So what I just showed you took about, it was on the order of 12 to 15 minutes to compute in some settings. There are a bunch of systems level work you can do to try to speed that up to its interactive time. And the join operator, that actually has been implemented at that point, so that's no longer future work. On the longer term, constructing this database of everything makes you wonder whether domain independence has been an assumption of a lot of the work, but there's some reason to believe that it gets you a lot of the way there and not quite all the way there. So, for example, here are the 5 most popular relationships extracted from text using the earlier system I mentioned, and here are the 5 most popular schema types that you extract using the WebTables system. So here, these are all fairly reasonable things that human beings could do, right? This actually reflects pretty well the fact that we write about human comprehensible topics. When you talk about table embedded data, it tends to be a lot more transactional information. So you have web access logs, phone numbers, album listings. If you get further down, you find things like manufacturing logs or products for sale, things like that. So the kind of data that you talk about seems very tied to the mode of expression in which you use, that you use. Now, I think the number of modes of expression out there, it's probably greater than 2, but it's probably smaller than 50. So actually writing an extractor for every reasonably popular mode of expression seems like a fairly plausible project. And so a multi-model, multi-extractor method seems like the way to go to try to actually compose a very comprehensive database. And this has a lot of overlap with model management operators. There's a deduplication challenge here at a scale that not many people have done previously. And you want to do some new kinds of tools for sort of the extractor-user interaction cycle, which I think would be pretty interesting, and I haven't seen any existing work in it. All right, so I'm going to conclude and then get ready for questions. But I hope I've convinced you that the structured web is already out there, but it's in a raw form that none of our tools can actually use right now. And a lot of the traditional database tools and information extraction approaches don't work when we apply them at such large scale and on such varied data. But with the work I've described so far, we can already process a large number of data types and kinds of data that are out there. And together, I think we're approaching this sort of vision of the mechanically addressable structured web. We're not there yet, but we've made quite a lot of progress. So thanks very much, and I'll take your questions.
schemas are a lot like forms. Have you given any thought to how what you've learned about schemas by looking at databases might be used to help get at the hidden web, or just understand the forms that are out there too?
Yes, certainly we can do, it would be very possible using the data we have to do some amount of, say, or here's one possible way you could do it. Using the data we have, we could do some amount of schema clustering to try to identify schemas that are marginally different from each other, but are basically talking about the same kind of topic. This would be very useful when talking about deep web access, where you might have some amount of, you might have a technique for accessing one particular schema, either through human guidance or some other technique, but you can't access all the forms that are very slightly different, or you're not sure that you can. By looking at our schema information, you could mechanically not only figure out that you should have good reason for accessing form B, but also using our data, maybe you can make good guesses as to how to populate that form. We've actually done relatively little work using the contents of our extracted tables, but I think that's a pretty promising area, and we're already starting to do work in that. Yeah?
I have a question about the context. Like, for example, if I want to find a table of who are the presidents of the United States, but in such a table, like, I may find many tables on the web about the president of a certain organization. Like, every organization makes a table with the president and in which year. And how can you distinguish, like, which table is about the president of the country and which table about the organizations?
So doing so is not necessary for the projects I described here today. We do have another application which does make it necessary, which is something like a structured database search engine. So someone types a query, say presidents of the United States, and what they get back is not a ranking of URLs, but a ranking of databases that we've recovered. So hopefully the first database that they see is something like the one I showed, and not a history of all the presidents of GE, for example. Doing that is essentially a ranking challenge that involves a lot of different features, which you can guess at. Features of the page, textual ones, things that are similar to search engines. Some that are unique to managing our structured data are things like, do you have a text query hit on the schema itself as opposed to the contents of the database? Or alternatively, it seems like in a lot of cases, people are using the leftmost column as a key or a human comprehensible key to describe the entire tuple. So if you have, say, population France, population would make a great schema hit. France would make a good row ID or key hit, right? If you have a hit on both those two individual terms, then this gives you a lot of strong evidence that the database you're talking about is a pretty relevant one for the query at hand. If you're talking about presidents of the United States, then you can imagine two different databases. One where the page's title is Presidents of the United States, and it's a pretty good result. Another in which it's Presidents of the World, and United States is simply a value in the table. And the next row might be the President of France, say. That's a ranking challenge where you hope to weight a hit on the title of the page more strongly than a random hit in the middle of the page contents. That work is challenging, but we intellectually know how to do it. Yeah?
An idea, how do we quantify progress in the future? Because you're saying we made a lot of progress, but there's only anecdotal evidence here that, right? Even, I don't know, slide 39 or so, you showed some relationships. I'm not sure that those were random examples, because I don't expect random examples to be that nice, of columns and tables.
Yeah.
So, and this thing, I got 3 years of sigmod instead of, looking at 3 pages. It didn't solve the problem, really. It was a nice example that you get high accuracy, although not perfect.
Yeah.
But in order for this to be usable, this is nowhere near usable to me. Right?
Well,
so how do we quantify progress in the future, in your vision? So what do we do to start quantifying that?
Especially in this last point, I described in an anecdotal way here today. We have experimental results on what we believe is a plausible workload of queries. So a major challenge in this area is that there's no plausible existing workload for, say, structured queries over a search engine that replies with databases instead of URLs. You can't just use search queries because Brittany would be, there's no one's looking for structured tables about Brittany, right? There's a set of things that are plausible things for looking at structured data. The way that we solve this in our paper, we get decent results over a workload of about 100 or so domains. The way that we chose that workload in our case here was we didn't want to poison it in the way you described by hand choosing things. So we asked people on the Amazon Mechanical Turk to say, if you were looking, we phrased it in a certain way, but the way we did it was to try to suggest examples of structured data in the universe, and whatever people on the Mechanical Turk told us, that's what we use as our workload. That is a admittedly very flawed approximation of what I think will be a workload on these kinds of systems in the future, but it's the best we can do right now.
I don't know. This is progress, but I'm just saying that probably we need to formalize this problem much better for in the future, and that's the biggest challenge, maybe.
Yeah.
Actually, to know when we made a lot of progress or when we just touched the water, because as of now, there's lots of work in this world around, and each work claims progress, but it's not clear. I don't know how usable all this is. I don't know, in a company, in a real search engine, or I don't know, even academically. How do you compare two systems?
Well, what you're describing is a real challenge, but I'd point out that in the similar case of search engines, it's very difficult to say, even where we have much better data in search than we do here, you can only say in a very, very constrained way whether search engines are getting better or not. One way you can do is simply by doing an A/B test of one ranking algorithm versus another on an identical workload, right? And we have a very good idea of what that workload should be because we've been running search engines for 10 years or more. If you want to say, are search engines today better than search engines were 5 years ago? That's actually a kind of intellectually incoherent question in some ways, because not only is the workload changing, but also the underlying structure of the web is changing, and there are a lot of difficulties. So even in an area that we universally agree is useful, where we have a ton of data, where there's a ton of money in it, we can only, in a very loose way, kind of assess our progress. So doing so is going to be very difficult in the setting that I described. Yeah?
I thought you'd connect up the first part of your talk to the second part of your talk, or rather the second part, learning from tables. You seem to be learning only the schemata, but not so much learning from the content of the table.
So we've started to do more work in that area. So one example is the kind of database auto-population stuff that I mentioned in future work, which is more closely ongoing work, where you may want to say, you give the system an example of a class, say city, and then we automatically emit contents, examples of city that we've derived from the contents of these databases. It can be a little trickier than that because the label that you find in a structured database is not necessarily a good class label for something. One database might have city, which is a pretty great class label. Another one might be place of birth, which is a worse one, right? I mean, you don't think of San Francisco as a place of birth, it's a city. And so there's work you have to do to try to find mappings between these things. So there's a sort of, we're thinking right now that there's a handful of labels that we view as kind of good type labels, and then we have to have containment relationships between these. So we know that places of birth are probably contained within the set of cities. San Francisco or California cities are contained within cities, and we might find other sets that overlap. So we're approaching it from that perspective, that we have examples of objects in the universe that have been labeled with something by a user, and by looking at how the sets overlap, we may be able to get information about how the labels semantically overlap.
Actually, I'm thinking of something much simpler.
Yeah.
A table is a set of facts.
Yeah.
I thought you would take that and put it in your, add it to the text facts that you learned in the first part of your talk.
Well, one problem is the thing I mentioned at the end of the talk, which is the set of facts that you extract in text versus the set of facts you extract from tables. They're very different. And so in one sense, that's great because it means our corpus of knowledge about the universe is getting better. In another sense, it's a little disappointing because you can't use the two to kind of check each other or to populate each other in some way. So we find a lot of places of birth and biographical style information in the text case, a lot of transactional information in the web case. They overlap somewhat, but for example, place of birth or the born in attribute is, I think, the third most popular in the text case. I think born in, when it's a place, is something like the 900th most popular in a structured setting. And when you talk about born in as a date, it's like the 3000th most popular. So the use cases are quite a bit different. That might have been an interesting aside. I don't know if I've actually answered your question. We can talk about it more or after the fact. Yeah, okay. Are there any more questions? Yeah.
A slide or two back, you mentioned between 2 and 50 modes of expression that
Sure.
require separate handling. Can you give a couple of examples?
So, text is a big one. Tables and lists are another. I think tagged data objects are probably another, that you may be able to recover some structured information from simply the combination of like a unique identifier and then words that describe it. Other modes would be subsets of text that are more semantically or computationally tractable. So our model of text right now is very basic, that you can express very complicated relationships in text, but we assume things like an extracted fact is always true. There's no notion of time, right? I think that a textual extractor that had more of a temporal idea in it would be, you could consider another mode of expression. Another that people have worked on very successfully are extracting data from Wikipedia-style objects. So people use the info box. Some people have used the notion of sets or lists that are in Wikipedia. And Wikipedia itself has some notion of time. So you can look at the previous holder of various offices and the next holder of various offices. I was using 50 to kind of sandbag it. If I had to guess, I'd say it's more like a dozen. Or at least you can get most of the useful data out there with a lot fewer than 50. All right, well, thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.